Welcome to episode 19 of One's World. I'm going to talk about George Orwell today, and you might think, well, this is supposed to be a series on opposites and oppositions, so where does George Orwell fit? Well, he fits for a number of reasons. He fits mostly because of his novel 1984, and in particular the use of newspeak, a new version of English language designed by the party in 1984 to help control the way people think. And the premise here, which is a little bit dubious, and I'm going to investigate it, is that if you can control the language of a particular group of people, you can control the way they think. Well, I think there is some validity to this notion, but it's not really on very firm ground. So let's get into it. So I'm focusing on George Orwell today, first and foremost because he's one of my favorite authors. I've read every book he's written and most of his articles. And I'm particularly interested in his concern about language. And I'm going to take two different viewpoints. One is going to be from 1984 and his development of newspeak. And the other is going to be a little article that he wrote, which is still fairly popular among writers, called The Politics of the English Language. I'll put a link in the description below. Politics in the English Language is short and easy to read and absolutely fundamental reading, I believe, if you want to be a writer. But 1984 and politics in the English language are almost polar opposites. So we need to talk first of all about 1984 and then slide into politics in the English language. In 1984, there is, of course, Big Brother and his party that govern the people who live in Oceania, one of the three great empires, the others being Eurasia and East Asia, and you can see them obviously as somewhat metaphorical versions of the United States and Britain, Oceania, maybe also parts of Western Europe, but it's English speaking. And then there's Eurasia, which is Russia, and East Asia, which is China, representing the broad balance of power between the United States, Russia, and China as it existed in the post-war era. And I needn't explain to you exactly how prescient Orwell was concerning how these empires, these megaliths, developed. Anyway, we're just going to focus on Oceania because it's English speaking. And one of the concerns of the party is to control the behavior of the members of the party. That is, ordinary people. Not the lower class or proles, Orwell's version of proletarians, were of no importance. They were considered to be just too dull-witted and stupid and uninteresting to care about. But the bulk, the middle-class workers, the people who actually had an ability to think, were in need of control by the party. And one of the ways that they were controlled was via language. And the essential premise was that if you can control the way people speak, you can control the way they think. And that gives rise to newspeak, a new language that will not allow people to have thoughts that are counter to the party. Now let's just think about that first. Now the first premise that I would say is the most dubious is the premise that we think in words, that without words, therefore, we can't think. Well, that's not really right, obviously. We can think without words. But we do tend to use words a lot in our thinking. And I have to say that making these videos, for example, is very instructive to me because I have to turn my thoughts into words. And sometimes when I do, they sound stupid or they don't sound quite right because there's a mismatch between my thinking and the words I'm using. But let's just pass that by for the moment and go into depth a little bit, just a little bit, concerning what anthropological linguists have to say about words and thought, and words and culture. And the two anthropologists that I most want to focus on are Benjamin Lee Whorf and Edward Sapir. Edward Sapir was a student of Franz Boas and developed linguistic anthropology as a specialty, and Benjamin Lee Whorf was not particularly trained as an academic and didn't work most of his life as an academic, but he did do a lot of work on the influence of language on behavior. And he was particularly interested in how the words we use influence the way we think. Now let me give you a fairly common example, the use of tense in language. Tense meaning past, present, future, and all of the variants. Now again, this gets complicated and I don't want to go into all the various ways in which linguists develop their theories of tense. Let's just talk about what are nominally called tenses in English. You remember we've got things like the present, the past, and the future, but then we've got variations of them like the present continuous versus the present simple. The present simple, let's take the verb eat. I eat is the present simple. I am eating is the present continuous. But you can also have the past simple and the past continuous. I ate, I was eating, and then you get even more complex with the perfect tenses. I have eaten, I had eaten, the future perfect, I will have eaten, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole flurry of tenses in English, which if you're an English teacher to people whose native language is not English, you'll know it gets really complicated. I taught English to Chinese students and to Italian students and to Spanish students. And the Italians and the Spanish are mostly okay because their tenses are pretty close to English. They don't match exactly, and there are times when you really have to struggle to help them understand. The Chinese are just completely lost because in Mandarin Chinese, you really don't need a tense if you don't want it. You can just say eat. You know, I eat bread. I eat bread yesterday. I eat bread tomorrow. You just put a time marker in there and the verb is kind of understood to change to past or future. Or there are what are called particles that will modify the verb a little bit, but just a little bit. Such expressions as tomorrow I will have eaten 4 meals. It's just not something that you can easily translate into Mandarin Chinese. But you can convey the idea. Well, anyway, as far as Whorf was concerned, if you have a native speaker of a language that has few or no tense markers, that person's view of time itself will be very different from the speaker of a language like English, where the time markers are incredibly detailed and sophisticated. Okay, that's what we sometimes now call the Worfian hypothesis, that the language that you speak influences the way that you think. Well, there isn't a whole lot of empirical evidence to demonstrate that this is true, although there may be minor examples of it being true. But we cannot really say that language as a whole influences such profound feelings as the passage of time and what present and past and future mean. That's really just not been demonstrated empirically. But Orwell took these hypotheses to a degree at face value in 1984 and asserted, if you don't allow people to have the vocabulary of revolution, they can't be revolutionaries. And what Newspeak tries to present is a language that is not like natural language as we know it, but is more like mathematics, and that it's precise and perfect. Because we're always complaining, or well, some people are complaining. I don't complain. I happen to like the sloppiness of language. But people often complain that it's difficult to express yourself precisely in language, and there's always a degree of slippage. Okay, let me give you a couple of examples. Let's talk about the double negative, for example. Double negative is one of those great bugaboos of English teachers that is not particularly well understood in other languages, although there are some, but most European languages, like French, Italian, Spanish, and so forth, don't have the same problem that English has. English follows the rules of algebra. That is, a positive plus a positive is a positive. A negative plus a positive is a negative. A positive plus a negative is a negative. And a negative plus a negative is a positive. Those are the rules of algebra. And according to the strict rules of English, they apply also. So, we'll take two positives. I have eaten something. I have eaten, positive, something, positive. I have eaten nothing. That's I have eaten, positive, nothing, negative, so negative. I have not eaten anything. That's a negative plus a positive gives a negative. But I have not eaten nothing. That's a negative plus a negative, and therefore should be a positive. So that is, I have not eaten nothing should mean I have eaten something. And your pedant English teacher will go on and on about that. Well, the fact of the matter is that in dialect in English, you can say to somebody, you know, let's choose an East Londoner speaking a particular dialect of Cockney, and say, what you eating? I ain't eaten nothing. I have not eaten nothing. I ain't eaten nothing. And the pedant will say, oh, so you have eaten something. But we all understand that the person who says, I ain't eaten nothing, means I have not eaten anything in standard English. That the double negative in dialect in English strengthens the negative, which is exactly what works in French, in Spanish, and Italian. They use the double negative all the time to express negativity or increased negativity. So, like for example, in Spanish, to say I have not eaten nothing is the correct way to say I have not eaten anything in Spanish and in Italian and in French. So anyway, Newspeak attempted to turn all of language into specifically algebraically correct or mathematically correct language, so that there was no dispute and no chance to wiggle out of things. And so let me give you the contrast of good and bad and talk about how that works in Newspeak. Okay, so good and bad are opposites in English, sort of, but they're not really quite opposites. And as Orwell expresses in 1984, we can see that they're not quite opposite. That bad is not the absolute opposite of good. It is kind of opposite, but it will all depend on context. The word good, in fact, does depend greatly on context. To say he's a good man, what exactly does that mean? I'll come back to that in a minute, because I don't like the idea at all of a good sandwich, a good day. I hope you have a good day. What does that mean? And is it the opposite of I had a bad day? Well, most of the time it is, but not always. Like, the difference between good and bad is sort of opposite, sort of not. And what Orwell says in 1984 is that if you want to be absolutely precise, instead of having two different words, good, the positive, and bad, the negative, you simply negate the positive to create the negative, which we can do. We can say, this sandwich is good. This sandwich is not good. That's a direct opposite. Okay, so I want to get into a little bit more detail concerning Newspeak, and particularly good and bad versus the algebraic or mathematically precise use of Newspeak, eliminating the word bad and replacing it with the word good plus the prefix un. Now, you know, of course, if you know your English, that the prefixes for negation are quite complicated. They can be in, im, non, un, ill. There are a lot of them. But in Newspeak, there's just one, un. So if a thing is good, we say it's good. If it's not good, we say it is ungood. And that replaces bad. So that you don't have the opposition of good and bad with all of the sloppiness in there. You just say this is good or this is ungood. And if you want to intensify it, you can say this is plus good or this is double plus good. Right? So you've got different ways of magnifying or diminishing or negating, but it's all mathematically precise. And Orwell's idea was that if you have this mathematically precise language, it prevents obscurity, it prevents equivocation, but it also prevents poetry, it prevents emotion, it prevents all kinds of things. So let me just look a little bit at the intentional sloppiness of language and how good it is. Let's look at the double negative. Orwell, in Politics in the English Language, as we are getting there finally, says that one of the really awful uses of the double negative is in phrases such as, I am not uncomfortable, or it is not unpleasant. So you've got two negatives. You've got not something, something. And if we take a strictly mathematical view of language, then to say it is not unpleasant mathematically is equivalent to saying it is pleasant. but that just isn't true. Like, for example, how was your hamburger? Not bad. Now, you're not saying it's good, right? Good is the opposite of bad. But saying not bad is not the opposite of bad. Not bad. It's what we can think of is two poles. Like, we've got good here, we've got bad here, and we're going to negate bad, but it's not going to put it all the way over into the good pole. It's going to put it somewhere in the middle. So not bad means, yeah, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't great. You know, it was okay. So if you say, how was your day? Say, not unpleasant. How was the couch? Not uncomfortable. You're not saying the day was pleasant or the day was comfortable. You're saying it was okay. It was in the middle somewhere. Well, if you turn your language into newspeak, you can't do that because it's mathematically precise. It doesn't allow for that double negative to be sort of sloppy and in the middle somewhere. And you know what Orwell is saying is that in some cases that double negative is all right, you know, is useful. But our language is so much richer, so much more complex, that using like sloppy double negatives like that is in fact sloppy. That we've got words, we've got a huge vocabulary, and that is much better if we learn more words. So, for example, not long ago I was talking to a Chinese student, and she was saying that something was amazing. Amazing is a good word. I mean, in newspeak, amazing would be double plus good. This, you know, which would be precise. But the thing is that our words have so many nuances. And I asked her to provide me with a sentence saying, this thing is blank, and give me 10 words that are like amazing, but are not amazing, but give a richness to your statement. So it could be, this thing is astounding, fabulous, magnificent, awesome. They're all different words describing slightly different feelings. The trouble that Orwell was putting his finger on, and which is still with us today, is that people's vocabulary is just not very rich. And that we have a tendency to use the same word for everything. Everything's awesome, for example. That was a big one some time ago. You know, it started with the Datsun ZX, I believe it was a TV commercial, the Datsun ZX. It's awesome. You know, and so then everyone started saying, yeah, that food is awesome. I had an awesome day. You know, well, awe is something that you at one time reserved for seeing God. It's like you can kind of change your mouth. Oh, oh, oh. You know, awe was just an overpowering sense. Wonder, wonderful, having a feeling of wonder. Fabulous, like a fable. We can use all these different words with precision if we care to, but the nuances have been lost, largely because of the tendency to overuse these words. So politics in the English language for Orwell was kind of the diametric opposite, if you like, of 1984. 1984 shows us how you can reduce all of language to mathematical accuracy, and in the process you reduce all feelings. And the party's point being that if you lose all feelings, then among other things you lose all feeling about revolting against the party. You lose the feeling of anything, you've reduced it to mathematical precision. Versus politics in the English language, where Orwell is imploring us to explore the nuances of vocabulary, to have richness, to have a richer life. And he's asking, and it's a very important question, which I will continue with next time. If you have a richer vocabulary, do you have a richer emotional or spiritual or aesthetic life? Very good question. I'll consider that next time. And meanwhile, if you like this kind of thing, then please subscribe. See you next time.